Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce today Jonathon Lookadoo, who is Associate Professor at the Presbyterian University and Theological Seminary in Seoul, in South Korea. Jonathon has got his PhD from University of Otago in 2017 with a thesis on metaphorical depictions of Jesus in the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. And he, since then, has published broadly on Ignatius in different times and slices of that ever-shifting figure. But he also wrote a wide-ranging handbook on the Shepherd of Hermas, as well as a commentary to the Epistle of Barnabas. And today we get to hear him talk about the Martyrdoms of Ignatius in Greek. Jonathon, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, everyone. Let's see. Let me just try to share my screen here.
Can you repeat that?
Yes.
Please.
Actually, I think it just came through. So yes, I think, is that visible to everyone?
Yeah, but in slide mode.
Yes, that's right. Let's see here. There we are.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Well, I'll go ahead and get started if that's okay. So, whatever one makes of the ongoing disputes about Ignatius and his letters in the 2nd century, the various writings about Ignatius and attributed to Ignatius suggest that his late antique reception was pluriform and rich. To borrow from the words of an apostle whom Ignatius admired, if he was not all things to all people, Ignatius at least became many things to many people. Like the Ignatian letters themselves, stories of Ignatius' martyrdom have been transmitted in various traditions and translations. While the traditions about Ignatius' death can sometimes be unwound in the manuscripts to come to more or less independent stories, alternative versions are combined in ways that suggest the agglutinative and subtly creative tendencies that lie behind the work of their late antique authors and editors. This paper will focus on 3 presentations of Ignatius' martyrdom. Since J.B. Lightfoot's work in the 1880s, these martyrdoms have come to be known as the Antiochene Acts, the Roman Acts, and the Acts of Simeon the Metaphrast. After a brief introduction to each martyrdom narrative, this paper will consider how literary authority is conferred to Ignatius via his connections to the apostles. Such references are clearest in the Antiochene and Metaphrastic martyrdoms. The Roman martyrdom presents Ignatius' authority somewhat differently. While the apostles implicitly continue to confer authority to Ignatius, the Roman martyrdom presents Ignatius as an authoritative figure in his own right. This paper will explore these dynamics in 3 Ignatian martyrdom narratives and ask 2 questions in lieu of a conclusion. To preview the questions in advance, why is Ignatius an authoritative figure for the authors of the martyrdom stories, and how do they ground Ignatius' authority? The Antiochene martyrdom, just to introduce these stories, the Antiochene martyrdom is extant in Greek, Latin, and Syriac. An Armenian account of Ignatius' martyrdom also utilized the traditions from the Antiochene Acts, but combines these traditions with elements found in the Roman martyrdom. The Antiochene martyrdom is so named because its geographic focus is on the city of Antioch. Ignatius' trial and conviction before Trajan both occur in Antioch, and his relics are then transported back to the city after his death in Rome. The Antiochene martyrdom also contains Ignatius' letter to the Romans. The Roman martyrdom is extant in Greek and Coptic, and as the name suggests, the city of Rome takes a larger role in this version of Ignatius' martyrdom. His trial occurs in Rome. He speaks before Trajan as well as the Senate, and his interview is conducted under torture, which the narrator describes at length. The two lions that kill him only crush him. They don't mutilate his body in any way so that his body can protect the capital. And his body is then buried in a place where Roman believers can assemble for worship. The third story taken into consideration is the Acts of Simeon the Metaphrast. Known as the paraphraser or the rewriter, the Metaphrast, Simeon is best known for his collection of saints' lives compiled in his Minologion. Ignatius' feast day is included in the Minologion on December the 20th. Writing in the second half of the 10th century, Simeon's account of Ignatius creatively reworks his source material, which stems from the Antiochene and Roman martyrdoms. For example, the trial occurs in Antioch, but also includes material drawn from the Roman story. Simeon's narrative also includes a letter from Ignatius to the church in Rome, but the letter exists in an otherwise unattested form. Aside from the fact of Ignatius' martyrdom and the late antique reverence toward the martyrs, the links between Ignatius and the apostles provide a vital basis for the authoritative potential that memories of the Syrian bishop continued to have for readers of the Antiochene and Metaphrastic martyrdoms. General claims to apostolic connection stand alongside references to named apostles, their writings, and their lives. References to John and Paul are spread across the Antiochene and Metaphrastic Acts, so that these are the most prominent apostles mentioned in both stories. The Antiochene martyrdom prominently places Ignatius in the train of disciples stemming from John. At the first mention of Ignatius' name, the author identifies him as the disciple of John. Ignatius does not mention John by name in his 2nd century letters, but he came to be associated with the brother of James increasingly prominently in late antiquity. Although the Greek manuscripts of the Antiochene Acts identify John simply as the apostle, the Latin and Syriac translations specify that Ignatius was the disciple of John the apostle and the evangelist. By naming John as the evangelist, the Latin and Syriac translations link Ignatius back to Jesus through John. The connection with John deepens later in the story when Ignatius arrives in Smyrna on his way to Rome. There he meets Polycarp, whom he already knows as a fellow pupil of John, for they had formerly been disciples of the apostle John. Ignatius is not only found in an apostolic web that includes John, but is also placed alongside Polycarp as a fellow student. Both the source of Ignatius' familiarity with Polycarp and the ground of his authority stem from his days as a pupil taught directly by John. The links between John, Ignatius, and Polycarp are also highlighted in the Acts of the Metaphrast. When Simeon introduces Ignatius before beginning the martyrdom story proper, he identifies the Antiochian bishop as a disciple of John the Evangelist. Simeon goes further than the Antiochene martyrdom by linking Ignatius' appointment to the position of bishop as Antioch with his knowledge of John. So Simeon refers to John as a priest, drawing on a way of referring to John that goes back at least to Polycrates in the 2nd century. And then from Simeon's 10th century perspective, both John and Ignatius are fittingly described using priestly terminology. Because Ignatius learned from John, he was appointed as bishop with apostolic approval. For both the Antiochene and Metaphrastic Acts, the story that follows their early references to John is important because it offered a connection to an apostle mediated by Ignatius himself. Ignatius' apostolic connections do not stop with this link to John, though. The Antiochene martyrdom arguably makes more of his Pauline affiliations than of his Johannine links. One way in which the narrative does this is by positioning Ignatius as an imitator of Paul. Although the stops along the martyr's journey from Antioch to Rome differ in the Antiochene martyrdom from Paul's stops as they are described in Acts 27 and 28, the Antiochene martyrdom alludes to Ignatius' respites in Troas, Neapolis, and Philippi. These are cities in which the Lucan Paul also journeyed. The Antiochene martyrdom draws more attention to Puteoli. When Ignatius sails by this Italian city, he desires to get out of the ship, quote, because he wanted to follow in the footsteps of the Apostle Paul. After being shipwrecked in Malta, the Lucan Paul entered Italian soil through the port of Puteoli in Acts 28. The later Acts of Peter and Paul that are attributed to Pseudo Marcellus likewise describe Paul's landing at Puteoli. Ignatius is thwarted, though, by a strong wind that prevents the ship from entering the harbor, at least in the Antiochene Acts. So instead, he blesses the Christians in Puteoli before landing in Italy at Portus. The Antiochene martyrdom further enhances Ignatius' Pauline association by echoing language from Paul's letters. In the exchange between Trajan and Ignatius, for example, Ignatius dismisses Trajan's claim to piety by accusing him of demonic worship and appealing instead to the worship of one God and one Christ Jesus in words that resonate with 1 Corinthians 8:6. As the trial dialogue continues, Ignatius identifies the crucified Jesus as the one who empowers his followers to crush demonic power under his feet. Ignatius' response echoes Paul's prayer for God to crush Satan under the feet of his audience in Romans 16:20. As Trajan continues to question him about what it means to be a God-bearer, Theophorus, he declares that he carries Christ, and he cites 2 Corinthians 6:16 in support of the belief that all followers of Jesus are indwelt like him. After he's condemned to the beast, Ignatius then rejoices because he has been deemed worthy to follow Paul in iron chains. But the Antiochene Acts also present him as speaking Pauline words. Simeon the Metaphrast likewise connects Ignatius to Paul. His version of Ignatius' martyrdom follows the Antiochene Acts in having Ignatius cite 2 Corinthians 6:16 while explaining what it means to bear Christ in oneself. When Ignatius is condemned, Simeon describes the chains in which he is bound and the guards under whose charge he is placed. And the Metaphrast describes the results with reference to Paul. When Ignatius is chained, he will become a chained spectacle, quote, in accordance with the Apostle Paul. It's from the Metaphrastic Acts, chapter 9. Alluding to 1 Corinthians 4:9, the spectacle is displayed to the world, angels, and people. Allusions to Paul's letters are enhanced in the version of Ignatius' letter to the Romans that Simeon includes within his martyrdom, and they are strengthened even from those included within the Antiochene Acts, within the letter included in the Antiochene Acts. So, for example, in Romans 3:3, within the Metaphrastic version, Simeon includes language from 2 Corinthians 4:18, where no such language is found in the version preserved within the Antiochene martyrdom. Like Paul, within the Metaphrastic Acts, Ignatius lands in Italy at the port of Puteoli, so different from the Antiochene Acts. Simeon does not explicitly refer to Paul at this point, but he places Ignatius landing in that port. And then near the end of the narrative, Simeon quotes Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, and in so doing, he overtakes Polycarp's reference to the death of Ignatius, Zosimus, Rufus, and Paul. Simeon thereby approves of an early connection between Paul and Ignatius, drawn by the Smyrnian bishop, whom he earlier identified as a fellow disciple, with Ignatius of John. The author thus creates an apostolic web in which to locate Ignatius while simultaneously positioning him alongside Polycarp as a fellow associate of the apostles. Simeon actually expands the web of apostolic links that Ignatius had in a way that is not found in the Antiochian martyrdom by referring to Peter. Admittedly, Peter does not figure as extensively in the story as John and Paul, but he is the first apostle whom Simeon mentions. In an introduction that is not attested in the Antiochian or Roman martyrdoms, Simeon traces the early episcopal history of Antioch back to Peter. Quote, "For Euodius succeeded Peter the Great, while Ignatius became an emulator of Euodius's custom and virtue." That's the very first, I think it's the very first line of the Metaphrastic Acts. It's from 1:1. The Metaphrast follows Eusebius of Caesarea, enlisting Ignatius as a bishop after Peter and Euodius. While Simeon reports that Ignatius was the child whom Jesus took to himself when Jesus was teaching about children in Matthew 18, this story is sandwiched between the references to Peter and John. So the effect is to link Ignatius to Jesus, but to emphasize his connection to the apostles as more proximate. The Antiochian martyrdom thus inaugurated a tradition of associating Ignatius directly with named apostolic figures in the martyrdom narratives about Ignatius. For the Antiochian martyrdom, Ignatius' relation to John and Paul plays a vital role in rooting his authority in apostolic soil. The story of his martyrdom was valued by late antique audiences, in large part because Ignatius was a disciple of John who longed to follow in the footsteps of Paul. These roots secure Ignatius' story and the letter to the Romans therein. The Metaphrastic martyrdom shares in the same tradition, taking it over from the Antiochian source material. In so doing, Simeon broadens Ignatius' roots by associating him with Peter through Euodius and by including more allusions to Paul and his letters. Yet both writers share a depiction of Ignatius as an apostolic man. The authority that Ignatius received from the apostles is then transmitted to late antique audiences through the martyrdom narrative. So, the Roman martyrdom. If named apostles are central to grounding Ignatius' influence as an extension of apostolic authority in the Antiochian and Metaphrastic martyrdoms, the Roman martyrdom stands out due to its relative dearth of named apostles. This raises questions about how and why the author of the Roman Acts found Ignatius' story to be of sufficient sway to pass on to late antique readers without reference to figures like John. This is not to say that the apostles are entirely absent from the Roman martyrdom. When Ignatius' name is first introduced in the story, he is identified as the second bishop of Antioch after the apostles. And although Peter is not mentioned, Euodius is named as Ignatius' predecessor. So apostolic succession is stated briefly. Ignatius' authority is in line with the apostles, but his apostolic derivations are not elevated to the same degree as the Antiochian or Metaphrastic martyrdoms. One reason for elevating Ignatius' story, which is the effect that this choice not to connect Ignatius as closely to named apostles ultimately has, one reason for elevating Ignatius' story is his willingness to endure a lengthy and brutal list of tortures. So if we're thinking of why Ignatius has authority in the Roman martyrdom, his persona and his endurance are part of this, and the Roman Acts go into great detail about how he was tortured and what he experienced. In the process of describing this, Ignatius journey towards death might sound a bit more like Jesus, and the Imitatio Christi themes might run more strongly through the Roman martyrdom. These things might be argued, and that's fair enough, but I'd like to maybe think about a couple of other things in conjunction with apostolic authority and why Ignatius stands out a little bit differently within the Roman martyrdom. So although Ignatius' associations with the apostles and his commitment to persist in the face of torture and his embodiment of Jesus in his death collectively put Ignatius forward as an authoritative figure for the late antique audience of the Roman martyrdom, this narrative suggests an additional source of authority in the story, namely the central character who is its focus and the words which he speaks. While this effect is also true in the Antiochene and metaphrastic narratives, it is enhanced in the Roman martyrdom with two strategies. First, the Ignatius of the Roman martyrdom speaks at greater length than in the other two stories examined here. Ignatius' words are most concentrated during the trial scene, in which he defends the veracity of his beliefs in dialogue with Trajan and the Senate. The degree to which the Roman acts elevate Ignatius' speech quickly becomes evident when conducting a rough count of the number of lines that the trial interview takes up in the critical edition of Funk and De Camp. The trial scene in the Antiochene and metaphrastic martyrdom comprise 43 and 53 lines, respectively. Someone might want to count differently than I do, and that's fine. Apologies, wrong slide. But someone might want to count differently as to what qualifies as the trial scene. But even so, I think this gives a rough idea. But it requires 267 printed lines to cover the trial in the Roman martyrdom. In addition to the length, the scope of Ignatius' knowledge differs in the Roman martyrdom when compared to the Antiochene. In the Antiochene martyrdom, Ignatius is focused almost entirely on the question of what it means to bear God within oneself and which God that is. The dialogue in the Roman martyrdom extends more broadly over traditional apologetic issues, and Ignatius' reservoir of knowledge expands with the growing topic. The discussion of Ignatius' God gives rise to a condemnation of other Greek deities in the Roman martyrdom. And so Ignatius sounds much more like a learned defender and apologist, drawing together both the martyrdom genre and elements of early Christian apologies. Such persistent refutation leads the author of the Roman martyrdom to portray Trajan lauding Ignatius' great learning, even while rejecting his religious claims. The audience of the Roman martyrdom may have been encouraged to share Trajan's assessment of Ignatius' educational level. But while the dialogue portrays the bishop engaging in somewhat common apologetic tropes, his language recalls earlier pagan and Christian claims about the divine. So Ignatius echoes Clement of Alexandria. He refers to the burial of Zeus and traditions that are known from Callimachus and Cicero. He echoes Tatian and Theophilus and Athenagoras and Clement of Alexandria. This is not to say that the author of the Roman martyrdom knew all of that necessarily, but in drawing on these themes, the author presents Ignatius as someone who is very learned and is conversant in the same kinds of topics as these other figures are. So the first strategy is just the length of words and the topics that Ignatius addresses. The second strategy that the Roman martyrdom employs to elevate Ignatius' profile involves the use of his own words from elsewhere in his epistolary corpus. Ignatius' language within the Roman martyrdom alludes to his letters without including the entire text of a letter. So whereas the Antiochene and metaphrastic martyrdoms recall Ignatius' letter writing activity by incorporating the letter to the Romans into their respective stories, and as a whole, no such epistolary text is found within the Roman martyrdom. Instead, Ignatius' words are integrated into the story without marking them further. When Ignatius rejects Trajan's offer to become a high priest of Zeus, the Ignatius of the Roman martyrdom employs language from the earlier letter to the Romans by asserting his lack of desire for a, quote, worldly kingdom. No citation formula is given. The absence of desire for such a kingdom simply employs earlier Ignatian words as part of a list of things that Ignatius does not do and does not desire. In this case, these words are similar to words found in Romans 6:1, Ignatius Romans 6:1, where Ignatius states that the kingdoms of this age are of no benefit to him. In addition, in Romans 4:3, Ignatius describes how he has learned to desire nothing. And in some Greek manuscripts, in most Greek manuscripts of this text, the adjective that follows is nothing worldly, nothing worldly. So the worldly seems to come from the Greek text of Romans 4:3. Ignatius' lack of a worldly desire or a worldly kingdom in Romans is thus echoed in the Roman martyrdom. The integration of Ignatius' words into the story may continue in the next sentence of the story. Ignatius adds, "For what will it benefit me if I gain the whole world but lose my soul?" In Decamp's edition, he rightly notes that these words come from Matthew 16:26, or they may come from Matthew 16:26. However, they are also found in the Greek manuscripts of Ignatius Romans 6:1. To be sure, not every citation is integrated into the story in this way. Indeed, the very first citation of Ignatius Romans is marked as coming from a letter that he wrote. Still, the general tendency within the Roman martyrdom is simply to integrate Ignatius' words into the story. The results of such an integration are twofold. To begin with, the placement of other Ignatian words in the mouth of the martyr lends an air of authority to the later story. The words of the main character resonate with his earlier epistolary corpus, or with Ignatius' earlier epistolary corpus. In addition, words from Ignatius' letters are alluded to in a way that is analogous to Scripture. When Ignatius employs Paul's rhetorical questions about the fellowship that is possible between Christ and Beliar from 2 Corinthians 6:15 and 16, he does not mark the words with a citation formula, or at least not in the Roman martyrdom. Similarly, when Ignatius utilizes imagery from Psalms, Isaiah, and Job to denounce inappropriate piety directed to the heavens, Ignatius uses the imagery without calling attention to his sources. Thus, when Ignatius affirms his belief that fire, beasts, and breaking of bones will not deter him in his pursuit of martyrdom, and uses words that are drawn from Romans 5:3 to do so, Ignatius' diction becomes authoritative in its own right because it is cited and alluded to in ways that are similar to Scripture. This means of referring to Ignatius' letters both authenticates the martyr within the narrative and elevates the authority that his profile carries. In addition to references to the apostles, then, Ignatius' model of persistence and his imitation of Jesus, the Roman Acts goes on to elevate Ignatius' profile as a source of authority in itself. He and his words stand alongside the apostles within the Roman martyrdom. Having examined some of the ways in which Ignatius' authoritative potential is demonstrated in the martyrdom narratives, let us return to the two questions asked at the beginning of this presentation. Question number one, why is Ignatius an authoritative figure for the authors of the martyrdom stories? And question number two, how do the authors of the martyrdom stories ground Ignatius' authority? So in answer to the first question, why is Ignatius an authoritative figure? I've highlighted the differences between the Antiochene and Metaphrastic martyrdoms and the Roman martyrdom, on the other hand. But on the question about why Ignatius was authoritative, it is not clear that the martyrdom narratives allow the question to be answered with a great difference, even though, despite my presentation. For all three martyrdoms, Ignatius is a man who was connected to the apostles, and in his death, he demonstrated great determination and commitment to following Christ. And as such, he is a figure who can be honored with his own story and in his own right. I think we can say that about all three martyrdoms. But it is with the second question that the differences I have highlighted come to the fore. Ignatius' apostolic connections are brought to the fore more often and with greater specificity in the Antiochene and Metaphrastic martyrdoms. He was connected to the apostles as a disciple and emulator. In the Roman martyrdom, the apostles are mentioned as a group, and they're mentioned far less often. And so this presentation allows Ignatius, this presentation by the Roman martyrdom, allows Ignatius to speak with his own invested authority. To be clear, these should not be conceived of as sharply drawn differences in kind, but the differences between these stories represent alternations in degree that allow the Syrian bishop's apostolically derived power to be plotted at different points on a spectrum. If Ignatius' authority enabled him to become many things to many people, the way in which stories about Ignatius grounded this authority were likewise pluriform. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I'm looking forward to thinking about this together.
Thank you very much for this illuminating paper. I have many questions. So the floor is open to anyone who might like to throw in any question or comment or however one might want to join the conversation. So to me, it is very interesting to see how between free text we get a variety of apostolic connections put to work. So but to get back to the difference between the two earliest martyrdoms, what's the relative chronology? I'm asking because how I know there is some discussion, but how you see in view of what you described. So one of them has a full-on letter added in. The other one has a far more developed trial apologetic discourse. Why drop any of those? So I'm curious, how do you see this relationship and relative chronology between the two older ones?
Yeah, it's a great question. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure. And while I know that others have worked on it, I still think maybe the fullest discussions go back to the late 19th century with Zahn and Lightfoot. And while I've learned a lot from them, I don't find them fully satisfactory on this point, but I don't have a better way to go about it. So I still more or less adopt their datings as best I understand them, just somewhat begrudgingly. So I think that the Antiochene Acts probably date somewhere between, I think they have to come after Chrysostom, John Chrysostom, and his sermon on Ignatius, which would be sometime late in the 4th century. So with the Antiochene Acts, we're maybe looking at a very late 4th century text. But then I think we need quite a broad range. So maybe on through the 6th century and I don't have a strong reason for stopping it in the 6th century. So if someone has objections to that, I'm open to a later date. And similarly for the Roman Acts, maybe the 5th or 6th century, but while I think we can put a very broad time after which they must have been written, which I think is after Chrysostom, and then a very broad time before which they must have been written, which is before the Metaphrast. it's a little hard for me, at least, to be specific within that range. So I tend to adopt Lightfoot ends on, but without very good reasons, I acknowledge.
Yeah, we don't have the smoking gun for either of
Yeah.
for any of the termini involved much. Yeah, normally in many of the texts of this corpus that we look at, we do have texts that we do not make any apostolic connection. It's just, the reason for writing the book was different, was separate from that whole issue. Like, people have a story to tell, and they develop it, and it gets gory or not, and on they pop. And then in manuscripts, we get a bit of a title that picks up from somewhere else, mentioning that this is that figure connected to that apostle. And but in the text that you discussed today, these connections are really properly interwoven. And when you get the traditional one, the link to John, but then you get the new developments. You get the link to Paul, and not only by mentioning that they happen to be in the same place, but also by adopting language, Pauline language. And then you get also Peter. It's so in the cases that I mentioned at the beginning of this question, the things are separate. You get the narrative that has its own point, and then somebody link them to an apostle. In this text, where you get it's more to the core, would you say that in the narratives, as we have them, these connections are central or mere conventions? You know what I mean? The ponder of it in the whatever these texts were intended for, of these connections, how would you say? It's marginal, central, the whole thing, there's nothing much else than this connection. I'm curious how you see that.
Yeah. In the case, at least in the case of the Antiochian Acts, I think it's relatively central to why Ignatius matters, that he was an apostolic figure. And the connection to John really intrigues me, which is probably why I started with him. I was trying to think about how to order the three apostles that are mentioned, and I started with John. I think just out of personal preference and curiosity, really, because if you look at Ignatius' letter to the Romans, he mentions Peter and Paul, which could provide grounds for then thinking about uh, why Ignatius and how Ignatius was connected to Peter and Paul. But John is never mentioned explicitly in the letters that are at least traditionally dated to the 2nd century, which raises the question, why put him in there? And I think it is that centrality, that connection to an apostolic figure, that then through the apostolic figure relates Ignatius back to Jesus. And I think a similar phenomenon is also found within the Metaphrast, whether and to what degree this is the Metaphrast's own thinking on theology, or how he maybe took that over from his sources. I probably need to read a little bit more on other metaphrastic narratives and martyrdoms, but I think it's relatively central, at least within the Ignatian one.
Well, the Metaphrast writes new texts without hesitation. For Clement, he combines on three texts and adds an episode that is not there in any of the others that we have today. So he's happy to be creative about that. So in a sense, the traditional, the least likely, or the most striking connection, apostolic connection in the case of Ignatian, is the traditional one, the one to John. That shouldn't be there, but it is.
I think that's
Very
right. Yeah.
interesting. Yeah, very interesting. So that didn't work much, not enough, which meant that writers later on were happy to add in new connection. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, those connections are expanded, and with the Metaphrast in particular, the Pauline and Pauline and Petrine connections are expanded significantly.
So we are looking in the project at the transmission of all these texts, and with that also of how the apostolic connection plays a role. But there is another dimension that becomes more evident as we work through, namely still authoritative sort of connections. I mean, authority infusing connections, but that work in a different way. So this is a vertical one with the apostles, let's say a vertical one, but there is also lateral connection going on, and we see it every now and again. In the Dionysian corpus, there is a letter to Polycarp. So for the letter of Ignatius to Polycarp, there is now there is at least an argument that it might be genuine. But for the other examples that I have in mind, like in the epistolary of Dionysius, that goes with the corpus always. That letter to Polycarp, I don't think there's anybody out there arguing that that is something written in Dionysius. And then you get a letter from Clement of Rome to Dionysius as well, monastic text that's mentioned in monastic texts in Syriac is not preserved, but is mentioned as one of the base books for that. The letters of Dionysius to Timothy, of Clement to James, and things like that are happening. How do we get any of these lateral connections in the free martyrdom you discussed today? Is Ignatius linked authoritatively in a way or another to other figures that are in his position, really?
Yes, yeah. Polycarp, I think, is the clearest one, and I think that comes out in maybe two broad ways. If we just focus on the Antiochene and Roman Acts, and then the Metaphrast keeps both of them in there, although in his own way. But the Antiochene Acts refer to Polycarp as a fellow disciple of John, and so when Ignatius meets him in Smyrna, they were both fellow pupils or fellow students of John. And so there's a biographical connection between Ignatius and Polycarp within within the Antiochene Acts. The Roman Acts preserves this connection in an additional way. So it refers to actually Polycarp's letter in which he mentioned Ignatius in Polycarp wrote a letter to the Philippians, or such is the tradition. I realize there's different thoughts about the authorship of Philippians 9 and 13, but if we, for the moment at least, for the sake of simplicity in speaking, accept it as genuine, then Polycarp wrote a letter to the Philippians in which he mentioned Ignatius, and he, for the Roman martyrdom, it's being because never he
We lost you there for a second. Or am I lost for a second?
So sorry.
We've lost
Yeah,
you.
okay.
We've lost you
Am I
for
back
a
now?
wee second. Yes, you're back.
Yep. Okay. So I'm so sorry. I saw faces
No
frozen on
worries.
a screen, but I'm not sure where I got lost. So the Roman martyrdom just preserves Polycarp alongside Ignatius through Polycarp's letter, and then it's through that connection actually that Paul is mentioned as well.
So we get foundational sort of connections with the apostles, and then also consolidating ones with sort of peers. Would that
Yes.
sort of image work?
I think it works well. Yes, yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it works very well. It would be interesting perhaps to trace, if we use that imagery, and then, I don't know, a word like streams, just to, there would be maybe 3 streams flowing vertically, at least in the metaphrast, and 2 in the Antiochene acts, and then just 1 though flowing laterally. So it doesn't. It's perhaps not as broad as maybe
streams. Yeah, I like the imagery. Yeah, no, it's interesting to me. And another thing that I always ask for each of the texts in our seminar, how does the character of Ignatius evolve between these texts? Because so there is a term used in, you might have come across it in New Testament studies. They call it migration of a figure, of a character. So what remains preserved? I mean, when you move from one narrative to another about this or that biblical figure, some things are kept because they are immediately recognizable, and some things are dropped and others are added. And that can produce less monodimensional characters. You can get depth, or you can make them flatter. That's also a possibility that we've seen in a previous paper. You can get the situation, paradoxical situation, where a character gains authority because more texts are written, but the character itself becomes flatter somehow. Well, what's the situation with, in your perception, with Ignatius between the 3 texts?
That's yeah. Okay. So migration, the flatter or fuller, more rounded question is a really interesting one, and I'm not sure how to answer it straight away. But the migration question, um, the things that are kept from Ignatius are his desire for martyrdom, and
Makes
that
him
comes.
recognizable.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. So again, I guess I should just state my presuppositions, since all of this is disputed right now in 2nd century studies. But if we assume that something roughly approximating the middle recension is the earliest version of Ignatius' letters, and that they date sometime from the 2nd century, so well before the martyrdoms, then we have a desire for martyrdom that comes through very strongly in multiple letters, but especially in Romans. We also have Ignatius identified as an episkopos, as a bishop, for lack of a better term, and so we have him identified as a bishop, and that was very important to Ignatius. But the things that are lost are Ignatius fuller, 2nd century Ignatius fuller emphasis on hierarchy with bishops, presbyters, deacons. That's lost in the martyrdom narratives. And then there's something that's gained. His apostolic connections are present to some degree, you could argue, in the 2nd century letters, but they are enhanced and developed in the martyrdom stories. And Ignatius seems far more explicitly literary, particularly in the metaphrastic acts, and in the Roman acts. He seems to be much more aware of scriptural imagery and other apologists and things like that. Or the apologists may not have been accessible to 2nd century Ignatius, but the scripture imagery is at least quieter in the 2nd century letters. So he does migrate, and I think there are maybe consistent patterns there. I'm not sure if that makes him more well-rounded or flatter. It might depend on which one of those which one of those criteria we privilege.
Yeah, fair enough. I think it's interesting. Thanks for mentioning it. That what makes, I mean, however we date the corpus of letters, all of them, I think, all virtually all theories would predate the letters to the martyrdoms. And in that context, it is remarkable that his main focus in the letters, one of the main focus, the hierarchy, does not make it through, doesn't seep through the martyrdoms. And I think from what you presented today, probably the most significant change in the character are the extra lines that he gives in the Roman martyrdom, the extra lines in the trial scene. I think that's a strong literary move in many ways. That difference in lines is not, I mean, between the Antiochian and the Metaphrastic 43 to 53, it was more or less the same, but the jump to 267, that's significant. Probably there is the most innovation in it, literary innovation and character development that we'll get from Ignatius. Maria, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is that, yeah. Yeah, thank you for this wonderful paper, Jonathan. My question is a follow-up on Dan's, actually. The circumstances of the martyrdom, or perhaps the instrument of martyrdom, the beast, are they presented the same way in all three texts, especially given the differing lengths of it? How's the circumstances or the instruments of the martyrdom described, or the sequence of the martyrdom described in these, and how different or similar are they?
Yeah, very interesting question. Yeah, two of them come immediately to mind. I am just checking on one. So with they all have in common that the instruments of martyrdom are beasts and or lions, but beasts more generally. The Roman martyrdom, though, stands out slightly. And I suppose to answer this, maybe I should mention that in Ignatius, in the 2nd century letter to the Romans, he mentions his desire for nothing to be preserved of his body. And that desire holds true in the Antiochian Acts and in the Metaphrastic Acts. There's very little that's preserved, just harder material like bones that serve as relics. The Roman martyrdom changes this a little bit. And so for all of its interest in gore and torture, at the end, the beasts just fall on him and suffocate him, smash him. And this preserves his body. That's the reason that that's important. It preserves his body so that it can then be buried in Rome and serve as a relic that preserves the city. And so in the Roman martyrdom, it's his whole body that survives, whereas in the Antiochian and Metaphrastic Acts, just his bones or the harder bits of material.
Very nice. Very, very interesting.
That's fascinating.
Andy, I think you have, and we're going to 11. This one goes to 11. Sorry, but the reference. Andy, you have maybe the last question, so please.
Okay. Well, I have many questions, but most of them are very basic because I don't know the text very well, so I will leave those out. I'm just curious about this tradition, which identifies Ignatius as a child that Jesus embraced. How common is this? Because you mentioned, so it's only in the Metaphrastic Act, if I understood correctly. So where is Simeon taking it from? Because the Syriac text that I edited, Dan, it also has this tradition, but the problem there is that it's from a manuscript from I think it's late 14th century Syriac one, so it might be taking it from somewhere. I don't know from where, but I'm just curious how common this interpretation is and where Simeon might have taken it from.
I should know the answer for you. It becomes common-ish in late antiquity, and it continues through the medieval period, and so it shows up even in 16th century Catholic Protestant disputes. It gets alluded to occasionally in the 16th and 17th centuries and some of the literature there. As to the first place that it's found, I might have to contact you and send it to you.
That's okay. I can look it up
Okay,
myself.
all right.
I was just wondering if Simeon was the one who, but he's taking it from somewhere else. That's what the main thrust of my question. Okay, I'll find it. I'll find it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I apologize. I should know this. I believe it's earlier than Simeon, but I don't have the reference in my head at the moment.
No problem whatsoever.
Well, on this note, I'd like to thank our speaker today for an illuminating paper, and to everyone who joined in today.
Thanks so much, everyone.